Welcome to another hot topic. Today I'm glad to say I'm joined by Nicky Morgan, Conservative MP for Loughborough, which is hardly local to our region, but until July she was also Secretary of State for Education, and we do have schools here. Nicky, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been in Grimsby today, you were visiting schools, I think Tulbar. What sort of welcome did you get?
Oh, it was fantastic actually. I mean, it's half term, so I was seeing some sixth form students who are studying government and politics, who very kindly came in, but also talking to the Chief Executive of the Multi-Academy Trust. And you know, one of the best parts of my former job was going to visit schools across the country, and previously I visited Healing Academy, which is in the local area too. I'm
going to just talk about education policy a little bit first, since that's your most recent government job. You've been objecting perhaps a little bit to Theresa May's ideas about grammar schools.
Yes.
What's your objection?
Well, I just know that we have great schools and great teachers in this country, but we don't yet have them everywhere. And so the white paper that I published back in March of 2016 was trying to set out the idea that we need to tackle those areas of entrenched educational underperformance. And I know from my time as Education Secretary that there's only so much bandwidth in a government department to deliver reform. And actually that's the big challenge in terms of bringing all schools up to the right standards, rather than having something else introduced into the system, which means that actually the education sector focuses on selective education or non-selective, rather than that laser-like focus on making sure that all children have access to an excellent academic education.
Well, there's bound to be, just as there's bound to be a difference between the abilities of children, there's bound to be a difference between the abilities of schools. If you say, former Secretary of State for Education, if I may, all schools must be excellent, you make the word excellent redundant. From what do they excel? There's going to be a difference of abilities in children, and perhaps it's appropriate that there's a difference in types of school that they have.
Well, you're absolutely right to say there's a difference of ability in children, but I wouldn't agree with you that actually just because we want everywhere to be good or outstanding, that somehow makes the word excellent redundant. We want every student to have a really great education. I think that every child is entitled to that. For me, it's a matter of social justice, and actually there are parts of this country where actually we can talk about choice, but parents and families and children don't have a choice because the school on their doorstep is not good enough. And the realities of travelling just aren't there. Perhaps they're in a more isolated area and transport costs are high. And I think that's what the government, which is a one nation government, and that's what members of parliament like me should be focused on, making sure that those schools, those standards are brought up, they have access to the best teaching and the best curriculum.
I suspect that there's a civil service influence about the use of the word outstanding there, which seems to create a certain amount of confusion. Outstanding from what, if all schools are outstanding?
Well, Ofsted have categories, good or an outstanding at the top two.
I'm arguing about the language that a bureaucrat uses in choosing these categories, I suspect.
But I think we all want the same thing, which is a great education.
Why is it that we have bad schools then? I mean, we've had, what, more than 100 years of compulsory education, state-paid for compulsory education in this country. Why is it that we are producing children who come out and can't construct a grammatical sentence?
Well, I think there's a number of things to unpick in that question, if I may. I mean, obviously, there's firstly the curriculum. The most important thing in raising educational standards is the quality of teaching. And we know, as I say, we have great teachers, but we don't have them everywhere. And there's been a reluctance sometimes to challenge poor teaching, to help those teachers to improve. And that's something that my predecessor, Michael Gove, took seriously, the ability to challenge to teachers for whom actually they might need support to improve, or potentially to think, actually, I'm going to move on to do something else within the education field. We've also seen, in terms of the national curriculum, that focus on literacy and numeracy, getting the absolute basics right at the start. And I think the quality of teaching now in our primary schools, is really, really good. I can see that in my own son, who's going through a primary school at the moment, the way that he is taught. So I think those are the focuses. But there's also been sometimes a lack of aspiration. And I will never forget the visit that I did to a school that's not in this region, to a primary school where the head teacher informed me that students in her previous school, which is in a northern urban area, were only ever going to be requires improvement. Now, if you've written off children before the age of 11, saying they're only ever going to be requires improvement, then I would argue that there is not a sufficient aspiration for those children.
There is a point where that's sort of the bottom end of not insufficient aspiration. There's also a point, this is a policy brought in before your government or the coalition government even in 2010, that something like 45% of people leaving school at 18 will go on to go to university. Now, if it's the case that 45% of the population has a degree, that means that a degree itself is not very informative about the qualities of their intellect, is it? If almost half the people, every other person has one, it's not worth anything. It debases the currency, does it not?
Well, I don't think there's a debate to be had about whether actually going on to university is the right path for every child, or whether it should be, we should stick to some number, some arbitrary, whether it's 50% or 40% going to university. And I think what we've seen under the coalition government and now the Conservative government is that growth in apprenticeships. Now, people can do degree level apprenticeships, but for many young people, actually, the right choice is not to go to university, but it is to start an apprenticeship, or perhaps to enter the world of work, and then perhaps to return to study later on. And, I agree with you. I think that what we've seen with the increase in the fees at university is students asking much tougher questions, and their parents, when they go to a university open day, what does this degree do? How many contact hours, how many teaching hours is my child going to get, or am I going to get as a student paying these fees? And also, where do students from this course go on to in due course? And those are good questions to ask.
There is another aspect of those fees, of course, where students are saying, why haven't I got my 2-1? I've paid for it.
Well, I think that's something, obviously, the universities. But one of the things that the universities minister, my former colleague Jo Johnson, is introducing is something called the Teaching Excellence Framework. And this is saying that teaching is as important in what a university does as research. And I think he's absolutely right to say this, because there hasn't been that focus on quality of teaching at universities. I mean, there has, obviously, because there are league tables, and I think we all know those universities where there's great teaching and where the students go on to high achieving careers, and those where it doesn't happen. But having something systematic where universities are measured on the quality of their teaching is, I think, going to be very, very influential in development of university policy.
Can I move on to something else you said, and a completely different issue? An MP, David Davis, not the Secretary of State for
with an
Brexit.
E, Davies, yes.
It's all very confusing, but another Conservative MP has recently been talking about children who are being taken from Calais into this country, getting asylum here. You've spoken out against his suggestion that there should be dental tests to see how old they really are. It is a little confusing, though, when the children that we see in the pictures on television, in the newspapers, are 6 foot tall and clearly haven't shaved for a couple of days.
But don't forget, we're talking of children up to the age of 18 or young people. And look, I think what I was really saying was that I think some of the coverage of this whole debate has been, it's been I think, really pretty shameful. And I think these are people who fled from a place of great problems, where they felt very unsafe, very unstable countries, and they are looking for asylum. They're looking, in many cases, to join family members who are already here in the UK. And actually to have their pictures, which are very selective, we don't know about what the other people and other children in the group look like, plastered on the front page of certain newspapers. What message does that send to those people looking to build a new life here in the United Kingdom?
Well, it also begs the question, if I may, that if we're so keen to help the children, why would we choose to help the children if not their parents? Would we separate a toddler from a mother? I mean, why would we not be wanting the adults to come just as much as wanting the children?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And what we're to particularly focus on at the moment, and what charities like Citizens UK, who are out in the Calais jungle camp doing, is identifying those young people who are unaccompanied. So they haven't got family members with them, but they have a right, because of family members here in the UK, to come. We know that the last time that the jungle camp was taken apart, 100 children went missing. I think that's shocking. I think it's shocking that happened on French soil. And I think, frankly, we in the West can do better in looking after people in their most vulnerable state.
Now, the English Channel has perhaps become more politically relevant than it's been for 40 years after June the 23rd's vote. Can I just establish your position? You were for remaining.
I was. I thought we were better off in the EU, but that's obviously not how people, the majority, who voted on the 23rd of June.
Having been supporting remaining, in that brief few minutes, really, when Michael Gove was standing for the leadership of the Conservative Party, you were a Michael Gove supporter. This is the man who, of course, who you replaced as Secretary of State for Education.
I did replace Michael, yes, look, Michael is he's a great social reformer. You know, I can see the power of his education reforms. I knew what he was doing in prisons and prison reform. I also had thought that it was better that somebody who had wanted to leave the EU, had led that campaign, would be the person who would then be in charge of the negotiations, of leading Britain out of the EU, and would be able to explain what are going to be necessary compromises as the negotiations go on.
Do you trust him?
Yeah, I mean, like I respect Michael hugely, and you know, I think he would have been a great Prime Minister, but that's not what happened. So, frankly, we now have a new leader in Theresa May, and we're all going to support her.
Nicky, I'm going to have to stop you there just for a moment. Join us again in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. I'm still with Nicky Morgan, Conservative MP for Loughborough and former Secretary of State for Education, visiting our region today. We were talking about Michael Gove, your support for him as a pro-Brexiter to be the leader of the Conservative Party. As you know, he didn't make it. Theresa May did.
Yep.
Consequently, you lost your job. Always a bit tough. It's brutal, isn't it?
Well, politics, nobody ever said it was for the faint-hearted. So I think you know in politics that you're in a job for as long as the Prime Minister wants you to be. So I now have a bit more time to go away and focus on a few other things.
Let's just talk about the details of this issue of Brexit. We had a referendum. The fact is that it's been widely touted, and it was legislated for as an advisory referendum. There is a great deal of discussion in which you've been involved that Parliament, a sovereign Parliament, might itself have a second say on this matter. What would you see as the role of Parliament in, how should we put it, defining the decision that was arrived at by the referendum?
Well, I think there's a good few points there. I mean, firstly, I don't hear from really any members of Parliament, apart perhaps from the Liberal Democrats, that Parliament should have a second say, if you like, on what happened on 23rd of June. I think the vast majority of members of Parliament accept the result, accept that we are going to be leaving the EU and will have a wholly different relationship outside the European Union. But that does lead on to the question of the role of Parliament in helping the government to define what that relationship is going to be. And before he became Secretary of State, David Davis talked about having a white paper that would set out the negotiating, the broad principles, if you like, of where the government wants to head. And I think that would be a good thing. And I think you're right. You know, people did vote for sovereignty, for the sovereignty to come back to the UK. So it would be very strange for our sovereign Parliament not to be involved in something that is the most momentous constitutional event that is going to hit this country for decades.
Well, I suppose, to make very broad lines, that's the difference between hard Brexit and soft Brexit. And as far as I can tell, with these very vague terms, the difference is that hard Brexit is coming out of the shared market, and soft Brexit is staying in there, which means also accepting some of the rules that the EU would implement without having input in making them, including rules about migration. Now, if that subtle, big distinction between what coming out of the EU means is left to Parliament, which would you be advocating?
Well, I think that we benefit hugely from having membership of the single market, but that's going to change because of the vote. So I think in terms of having access to, and the Prime Minister rightly has talked about wanting companies to have the benefits of trading in and operating in the single market. And yes, I think that although people want there to be controlled immigration, for the government to know who's coming in, how long they're coming in for, why they're coming in, I think to suddenly think that we're not going to have, any immigration, or we're going to really, slash the numbers, I think that will do damage to our economy. So I suppose you're right, the labels at the moment are very fluid, but it will put me on the side of let's not throw out access to the single market just in a bid to have no free movement of people at all. It's
impossible to make windows into men's souls or women's souls, but when that vote happened on the 23rd of June, do you think that it was the will of the people to stay within the single market?
I think that people voted to leave for a whole variety of different reasons, and I don't think it was clear from the Leave campaign that leaving the EU meant leaving the single market, and that wasn't the question on the ballot paper.
From the Remain campaign, though, both David Cameron and George Osborne made it very clear that a vote to leave was a vote to leave the single market.
But they weren't advocating leaving the single market. So those who were advocating leaving, did not say that was the consequence. Don't forget, they also promised us an extra, well, whatever figure you believe, 100 million, 350 million for the NHS. So it's quite hard to know exactly what people were. But the question on the ballot paper was, Do you want to remain in the EU or do you want to leave the EU? It's now for government, and I would argue with parliamentary support and scrutiny, to define exactly what that new relationship is going to be.
The advantage of having a sovereign parliament is that every 4 or 5 years we can kick him out.
Absolutely.
That's not the case with a referendum. Is a referendum that's effectively binding on generations to come? Is that a fair way of governing the future?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I was debating that with the sixth formers that we've seen at the school here, and I think that given we had a referendum to go in or to stay in the EU back in the 1970s, it's such a big issue. I do think it was right to ask people about it, but you know, you're right to say this is something that is going to define our country and its future relationships with the rest of the world for decades to come. But I think it was right. People did want to have their say on this critical relationship. They've had the say, and now we must actually negotiate a completely different relationship.
I just want to go back to your sudden and perhaps unexpected career change earlier this summer.
Yes.
The Conservative government was elected by a majority of about 12, I think, perhaps unexpectedly, with a particular philosophy, a particular ideology by which it presented itself to the nation. I'm not suggesting there's a presidential system, but it now has a new leader and a new philosophy, perhaps, a new ideology. It seems that the speech that Theresa May made in Birmingham at the conference a few weeks ago sounded to me like an almost Keynesian programme of borrowing to invest in infrastructure, which is quite the opposite of the austerity paying down the debt and deficit of the Cameron-Osborne regime. Have we got a government with an entirely different idea of how the nation should be governed from the one that we elected in 2010?
To be honest with you, I don't think it's entirely clear. I don't think so, because I think what the Prime Minister has talked about is being a one-nation Conservative government, and I think that's something that David Cameron would very much recognise.
Every Conservative describes themselves as a one-nation Conservative. Since Benjamin Disraeli, Margaret Thatcher would have described herself as a one-nation Conservative.
Well, I'm not. You're absolutely right to say what you call yourself and what you actually do in government can be two very different things. That we still have a manifesto that we were elected on as a party 17 months ago. And I think there will be questions asked if manifesto commitments start being stepped away from. I think on the economy, though, it was already recognised that the impact of Brexit was going to inevitably mean that we were not going to hit the balancing of the books, the target by 2020. George Osborne had already set that out, and I think we will hear more in the forthcoming autumn statement from Philip Hammond on that. But you know, I think we will have to wait and see. And I think the Prime Minister's speech covered a lot of ground in Birmingham. It was sort of appealing to different audiences, and I think we wait to see how this plays out.
I can only observe the House of Commons from the lofty position of the Fourth Estate here, but it strikes me that in the Conservative Party, in the Parliamentary Conservative Party, that there is almost a sort of a backbench resistance to Brexit, perhaps with you amongst its high command, and a frontbench resistance or mitigation of Brexit, perhaps with Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who has been speaking recently about immigration, saying we need lots more immigrants to come in, which perhaps is not what his newer cabinet colleagues would feel. Do you see a split coming down within the Conservative Party, within the ranks of the Parliamentary Party?
I think we're at very interesting times for the Conservative Party. You know,
I'm sure you are.
Well, I think for politics generally, and yes, I think there is. We need to wait and see what happens. I think Brexit has been such an earth-shattering thing for the country, for the party. I wouldn't say that we're leading resistance to Brexit because I've made it very clear. Brexit is going to happen. We're going to leave the EU. But I think the terms on which, then yes, there's a difference of opinion within the Conservative Party. And I also think that as a Liberal Conservative, that we do best when we are appealing to the mainstream of British politics, the centre ground, if you like, rather than wandering off, as we did in the years of opposition, to a place which actually didn't appeal to the majority of people in this country, because we didn't win those elections that we fought then. So we will have to see what happens. But yes, there's a group of us who will make the case for appealing to the centre ground, to the voters. I represent a marginal seat, and to win a marginal seat, you have to build a coalition of voters.
Well, I want to ask about that. Is that what's happening then? Because we've been analysing the Labour Party for the last couple of years, and we've been sort of assuming that it's new leadership. Jeremy Corbyn has been taking it far to the left and away from the centre ground, and that's what makes it incapable of winning a general election, because it's abandoned that centre. The Conservative Party is in danger of doing the same thing as it. We now have David Davis in the cabinet, Liam Fox, that they're very much the right. And it's not just on Europe, but right on all sorts of other issues, the right wing of the party, and all sorts of the sort of small c, almost socially authoritarian right is taking over and dragging that off the centre ground as well. Are we not leaving the centre exposed to all sorts of other forces, some of which might be crackpot eccentric parties?
Well, I think there's always a danger with political parties, and particularly those that don't have an opposition, which I think is the position we're in at the moment, really a functioning opposition. There are individual members of the Labour shadow front bench who are trying to be that opposition, but there is a danger then with any government that you do wander off to the edges of the political field, if you like, rather than remembering that elections are won with the centre ground. Now, the Prime Minister herself has talked about an industrial strategy. She's talked about a more interventionist government. She's talked about the centre ground moving. So I think we have to see. I think all those things were in her speech in the party conference. And I really wouldn't describe Theresa May as a right-wing Conservative, because that's not how she has been.
She might not be, but her cabinet perhaps is.
Well, but then there's a mixture. I mean, look at obviously people like Damien Green, for example.
We will look at them, but I'm afraid not right now. We're going to have to stop there. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Join me again next week. We'll have another hot topic.